In this tutorial, we're constructing a stained glass panel lampshade. We're starting with 6 soldered panels. The edges are all tinned. Everything is washed off, clean and dry. We're taping everything face down with the tape on the inside. All the lower edges are aligned. We pull the shade from the top into a cone shape, and then we tape the ends closed. We do a check at the very top to see that the opening is a proper hexagon. The lower edges are all in a line and resting on the board. The top edges of the lampshade are a tiny bit off in height, and that's okay. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to be tacking the upper edges. Apply some flux, and then place the solder right at each spot where the panels meet, and just press the iron down so that you melt a tack right on that upper edge. Now you can tack the lower edges. Rest the iron in between so that it's touching both panels, and then you feed the solder right onto the iron till it forms a tack. Because it's in a vertical position, the tack is going to drip, of course, but it still holds everything together. Keep turning the board until you've got all of the lower edges tacked. This is what we're aiming for, tacking it in this position. So I first flux all of the seams. And then we're going to be tacking and then pushing the solder in to feed a drip. And I move all the way down. On this size of a panel, every ½ an inch, I've got around 8 or 9 tacks. Wherever you remove the tape, add a few more tacks in. Now we're ready to solder the inside. We don't wash off the flux because this is very fragile. We're going to use props. In this case, they're solder wedges. Position one seam at a time flat against the solder board and wedge the props right underneath. For each seam, remove the tape and only solder the side that is resting against the solder board. Fill the solder into the seam. We put flux, and then we feed the solder right in. This first pass with the solder seam is just to fill that gap. That solder is going to go in between the panels, and then it's going to hit the board. You can also reuse solder bits by laying them along the seam and then chopping them in. Now that this first seam is done, I'm going to go back over it and I'm going to add a bead. You always want the insides of your projects to look just as nice as the outsides. I like to drag the soldering iron along the seam while feeding the solder. Just be careful not to put too much solder. The foil can only handle so much. So this is what the outside ends up looking like. It looks pretty gross, but we will fix it. This is why we do the outsides last. We wash off the flux and we dry the lampshade. Now we're going to put it in a nest. It's just a shallow box filled with crumpled up newspaper or other kinds of paper. It helps to support your project where wedges might be a little awkward. You're going to rest your lampshade so that each seam that you are going to be soldering points to the ceiling and is also horizontal. That's very important. You'll notice that the solder will start to drip if the seam that you're working on is slanted. There's a lot of solder that's sticking up, so what I like to do is just take that solder and sink the iron in to chop solder. If there's any spots where the solder is sunken in, I'll add a little more. But again, we're aiming for a bead. We don't want the seam to be flat. A beaded seam helps to keep the project more stable and sturdy. So I'm chopping in where it's sunken in. I also don't like to see the edges of the panels. That's what the bead helps to do. It's also just good craftsmanship. So you keep chopping. It may be rough at first. After I've beaded each seam, I'll use a wet sponge and I wipe off the dirt and the flux. I add fresh flux, and then I run the iron all down the seam just to melt the surface to make it smoother. The flux is also going to lift and suspend most of the dirt so it can be washed away. There's a spot that really needs a touch up. So this panel is horizontal. I don't have it leaning like it looks like I have. I put a little bit more flux and I blend it in with the seam. There's a little spot right there where it meets the seam that I touch up as well. Often you will need to wipe off the iron. All of your outside seams will be beaded this way. So you keep rotating the lampshade, chopping in solder, and then remelting the seam. Be sure to use plenty of flux and wash off your work as needed. The first time you chop the solder, it will be rough. That's when we drag our iron over it. When all the seams are done, the next step is to edge finish the lower rim. If you look at the seams and you notice that some are more rough, it's a good idea to wash off your flux, and then you can go back and do touch-ups. Now it's time to finish the lower rim. I set the lampshade back in the nest so that one panel is resting horizontally to the table. And I do what I like to call chop and dab. That's my nickname for edge finishing, or beading the edge. You add flux and then chop your solder. After the edge has been filled in, I add more flux and then re-chop or re-melt the seam. That will make it smoother. Keep rotating the panel. And finishing off each edge. The parts where panels meet might have a little bit of a dip or a gap. So very gently, you can chop more solder in. This takes a little practice, so don't get discouraged. When edge finishing, I'm only chopping off a tiny bit, about 1/8 of an inch or less from the end of that solder strand. Don't keep your iron in this spot for too long when you're filling in the dips. And now my edge finishing is complete. The next step is to wash off the flux. We do this often. And we are tinning the vase cap. We're coating the brass vase cap with a thin coating of solder, just on the front. Use lots of flux. Melt some solder. And then you continuously keep the iron making contact. Use the iron to heat up the brass. The hotter you can keep the brass, the more fluid the solder will be, and thus more smooth. If you need to pick up the vase cap while you're working, you can always use a wet sponge, just so you don't burn your fingers. If you want to smooth it even more, just add a little more flux and drag the iron around. You'll need to do this again after we've connected it to the lampshade. Wash and dry the vase cap. Rest it. The round part should touch the solder seams on each panel. That's when you know that you've got the right size. Use a piece of masking tape to hold it in place. You'll have some exposed solder seams. Now you're going to put it right back into the nest and tack where the seams and the vase cap meet. Keep the seams horizontal so it's easier to tack. You're going to tack all 6 seams this way, blending the vase cap rim into each seam. You'll have to smooth the top of the vase cap because there will be some visible solder that you might want to blend in. Wipe off the tip. And begin to smooth all around. We tin the vase cap so that when we patinate, everything will patinate evenly. The soldering is almost done. The only thing that we need to do is reinforce the inside. Everything is hanging from this base cap. So we need to make sure that there's enough solder on the inside to secure that base cap to the lampshade. I put the iron right in, touching the brass, and then feed the solder in. Do all of your seams that way. When you're done, wash it, add patina, and then polish. All done.